we are in week 3 of our study through the book of Mark, and we're in chapter 3 today. And in this chapter, we're going to see some pretty interesting things. So let's just jump right into it. We're going to start with verses 1 through 6. Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So there's several organizations of power, if you will, religious leadership organizations in the Jewish culture. And one is called the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is the highest court for both civil and religious matters. And it was comprised of all of the religious leaders. It had chief priests, it had Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, elders. But mostly it was comprised of Pharisees. The Pharisees definitely had the political power in the Sanhedrin. Well, in every synagogue in the area, there was a committee, if you will, of a subset of the Sanhedrin that would go sit in these synagogues and listen to the teachers to make sure that they weren't teaching any false lessons, false doctrines, and trying to lead the people astray. So when Mark says they watched Jesus, the they that he's talking about is that committee from the Sanhedrin. Primarily Pharisees are sitting there in the synagogue listening to what Jesus has to say, watching closely, listening closely, but they're not listening to learn. Right? They're not listening to try to gain what Jesus is sharing with the people. They're listening for an opportunity to entrap Jesus. Something, self-incriminating, something that they can use against Jesus. So in this particular synagogue, there happened to be a man with a withered hand. And based on some other documents, scholars believe that this man wasn't born crippled, that he was possibly a mason who was injured on the job, and so he could no longer work. And so Jesus, if Jesus healed this man, then he would be able to go back to work, provide for himself and his family if he had one. Well, this committee that was there, primarily the Pharisees, were plotting against Jesus, and they knew that Jesus couldn't resist himself. If there was a need presented to him, that Jesus was more than likely going to heal this man, and it was the Sabbath. And in their mind, it was against the law to heal somebody on the Sabbath. So it's really a setup. So that's the background here. Just realize what's going on. The Pharisees are setting Jesus up. So when I first read this passage, I thought to myself, why didn't Jesus just wait one more day to heal this guy? Right? He's obviously been hurt for a while. If he had just waited one more day, so it wasn't the Sabbath, one more day wouldn't hurt anything in the grand scheme of things. But then when you realize that this story is not really about Jesus healing a crippled man, this is about Jesus pointing out the hypocrisy of the religious leaders of that day. And so it really had to happen on the Sabbath, and I'll explain that as we go along. See, Jesus asks the Pharisees a two-part question that's very important for us to understand. So let's take a look at what Jesus asked. In verse 4, Mark says that Jesus asked them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill. So the first part, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? Well, Jesus is kind of putting the Pharisees in a hard spot because they know the answer. The answer is yes, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath, and it's always unlawful to do evil, but it's doubly unlawful to do it on the Sabbath. So it's kind of like one of those, driving through a construction zone. Fines doubled in construction zones. Well, fines doubled during the Sabbath. So you're not supposed to do evil, but if you do evil on the Sabbath, it's doubly bad. So Jesus is saying, is it lawful to do good or to do evil on the Sabbath? Well, one thing that the Pharisees were smart, they didn't answer. They just kept their mouth shut because they didn't have any. If they were to tell the truth, they would have to say, yes, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And of course, healing a man, giving him back his livelihood would be a good thing. Not healing somebody when you have the power to heal them would be a bad thing. So really, Jesus was following the law in healing this man. But they didn't want to admit that, so they just kept quiet. So the second part of the question is really a personal question. It's really hitting the Pharisees where their heart really is. He asks, is it lawful on the Sabbath to save a life or to kill? What was Jesus about to do? He was about to heal the man. He was about to give him his life back, right? Give him his livelihood back. He wouldn't have to beg anymore. He would actually be able to go back to work. What were the Pharisees doing? They were plotting to kill Jesus. They were looking for a way to do away with him, to accuse him, to take him before the Sanhedrin, and really to put him to death. So he is, kind of saying, I know what's in your mind. I'm reading your mind here. Is it lawful for me to save a life, or is it lawful for you to take my life? That's basically what he is saying here. That question is getting to the heart of what's going on. And again, they don't give any answer. Just to show you how strict the Sabbath laws were, it was very restrictive on how much medical care you could give somebody on the Sabbath. You were only allowed to give enough care to keep a life alive, to keep somebody alive, help them sustain through the Sabbath, so then after the Sabbath you could do whatever else. Like if someone broke an arm, not life-threatening, you couldn't set that arm until the next day. If a woman was giving birth, you could aid them in giving birth. If a wall fell on somebody, you were allowed to do enough work to clear enough bricks or rocks off of the person to ascertain whether they were dead or alive. If they were dead, you had to leave them there until after the Sabbath, then you could clear the rest of the stuff. If they were alive, you could do enough to get them out of the rubble and keep them alive until after the Sabbath. If they had broken bones, couldn't do anything with them. But you could give them water or do whatever you needed to do to keep them alive, but that was it. So the Sabbath laws were very, very strict. But so when Jesus basically point blank says, is it legal to do what you're planning to do? Is it legal to take a life on the Sabbath or plot to do so? They knew exactly what he was doing. He was pointing out the hypocrisy of their leaders. They were breaking the Sabbath, but they were accusing him of breaking the Sabbath when they were in fact the ones who did. So Jesus asked those questions to expose their corruption. And it really had to happen on the Sabbath because while it was bad to plot to kill somebody not on the Sabbath, he was kind of using the Sabbath laws that they were trying to use. He was using them against them. So that's why Jesus made the point of healing the man on that day rather than waiting for a day. So Jesus asked the questions. The Pharisees remained silent. Jesus healed the man. The Pharisees went out and plotted with the Herodians, who were Gentiles, to plot against Jesus. So they went against their own conscience, their own social standards, and they went and hung out with Gentiles to plot how to destroy Jesus. On the Sabbath, yes. So, all right, let's move on, verses 7 through 12. Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great crowd followed him from Galilee and Judea and Jerusalem and Idumea and from beyond the Jordan and from around Tyre and Sidon. When the great crowd heard all that he was doing, they came to him, and he told his disciples to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him. For he had healed many, so that all who had diseases pressed around him to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." And he strictly ordered them not to make him known. So remember, we are still early in Jesus' ministry. He had just getting things going. So his time had not yet come. He's not ready to go to the cross yet. He has a lot of work to do, a lot of groundwork to do before he goes to the cross. So knowing that the Pharisees were pretty out to get him, basically, he left the cities and went out to the villages along the sea. But the crowds continued to follow him. And, the more he healed people, the more people kept showing up. They were there for physical healing. And even though that's not what Jesus came for, he wasn't here for physical healing. He was here for our spiritual healing. He continued to oblige them. He continued to heal them. People continued to come. And this mob got so big and pressed in against him that Jesus had his disciples have an escape plan ready. So get a boat ready just in case, because these people are about to crush me. And picture this, people with diseases. Diseases can spread, right? You don't really want to be near people with diseases. Well, these people are crowding around him. They're not waiting for Jesus to reach out and heal them. They're reaching out to him. They're wanting to touch him, hoping that just by touching him, they would be healed. So it's a pretty dangerous situation there. So the boat is ready for Jesus if he needs to get away from the crowd. But the crowd wasn't really Jesus' biggest problem interfering with his ministry at this point. The main problem were the demons, because the demons knew who he was. Jesus isn't ready yet to reveal who he is, and the demons kept falling down before him and saying, "I know who you are, you're the Son of God." And so Jesus commanded them to be quiet. And that seems odd to us. Why wouldn't he? Doesn't he want the publicity? But that could just right then and there. Look, even the demons are saying who I am. But he's not ready yet to reveal who he is. Remember, the Jewish people and the Jewish leaders had one idea of what the Messiah was going to be. He was going to be a military leader. He was going to come in, free them from Roman rule. He was going to establish Israel as a nation, as a military power in the region. Well, Jesus, the Messiah, didn't fit that image. Jesus, the Messiah of love, the Messiah of grace and forgiveness. So he had to lay some groundwork first to really get their view of who Messiah was in the right perspective. So he wasn't ready for those demons to be telling people who he was. Let's continue in verses 13 through 19. And he went up on the mountain and called to him those whom he desired, and they came to him. And he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach, and to have authority to cast out demons. He appointed the 12, Simon, whom he gave the name Peter, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, or however you say that. But it means the sons of thunder. Thankfully, Mark tells us that here. Andrew, continuing on, verse 18. Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew and Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So Jesus' ministry is just getting going and is starting to progress. And remember, he's already identified 5 apostles so far, right? He got Peter and Andrew and James and John, and then Levi or Matthew, the tax collector. And so now Mark says, here's the rest of the gang. Jesus is starting to form his inner circle, the base, the foundation of those who will carry on his ministry once he gives his life for us, once he goes to the cross. He knows his time is short, and his ministry only lasted 3 years before he was crucified. So he needed dedicated disciples whom he could entrust his knowledge to, his power to, and who could be entrusted with capturing for us, future generations, all of the teachings of Jesus. The crowds couldn't be entrusted with that because the crowds were only there to get, for selfish reasons. They came to get what they wanted, what they needed from Jesus, and then they were gone. The crowds came and went. He needed dedicated disciples who he could pour his life into that would carry on the ministry after he went to the cross. So here he chose 12, these 12 dedicated men who would spend 3 years with Jesus at his side, witnessing every miracle, hearing every lesson, and then having those private times with just the 12 of them where Jesus would pour into their life and teach them and train them. Mark says that he selected them and would send them out to preach and to have authority to cast out demons. It's because of these dedicated men that we have the record that we have today, that we can study, that we can know, we capture the message of salvation, because they were dedicated. 11 of them anyway, did what they were told to do. Let's continue. Now we hit 2 very strange verses that are kind of hard to read and hard to understand. Verses 20 and 21. It says, "Then he went home, and the crowd gathered again, so that they could not even eat. And when his family heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, 'He is out of his mind.'" When you read this, especially out of context, if you just read this, it makes it sound like Jesus' family didn't believe who he was. They thought he was crazy. But that's not what's going on here. I think to really appreciate and understand what's going on here, you have to grow up in a ministry family, a pastor's kid or a missionary's kid, or be a pastor or a missionary, to really get the full understanding of what's going on here. When you go into ministry, you have to give up some things, and you have to do some things that are contrary to the ways of the world. I remember when my brother Dale went into the ministry. He was a hazmat paramedic in Phoenix and was doing very well. And when he announced he was retiring from the fire department and becoming a missionary to the Indian mission in Show Low, Arizona, people thought he was crazy. He had to give up so much to go to the Indian reservations to preach Christ. When I moved here to Norwood, I've had a great paying aerospace job, and when I resigned and said I was moving to this little town in Colorado to be a pastor and to start a ministry, people thought I was crazy. Now, did they really think I was crazy? No, that's a figure of speech, right? You're crazy to do that. They don't really think they are certifiable. Jesus' family didn't think he was certifiable. It's a figure of speech. But look at what Jesus did. From the world's perspective, Jesus left the family carpentry business, which I'm sure he was making a decent living at. He was at least able to provide for himself. It was a source of income. He left that behind to become a traveling missionary or minister and faith healer, if we use today's vernacular, and had no viable source of income. So if you leave a paying job to go do something that doesn't pay, people are going to think you're crazy, right? From the world's perspective, Jesus put himself in harm's way. He was constantly surrounded by crowds who were wanting something from him. He aggravated the political leaders, the religious leaders of the day, who could end his life. And he seemed to have sport at aggravating them. He was always going against them and prodding them and pointing out their flaws. Well, what sane person pokes the bear, right? Something that could kill you, you don't tend to go poke it. You stay away from it. So that's what's going on here. I don't think that his family was disrespecting him. He wasn't even taking care of himself, right? When you're in ministry, you give time to everybody but yourself and to your family. And Mark says here, didn't even have time to eat. So they're saying, come on, they went and grab him, try to save him from this crowd, drag him back into the house and sit down and eat, would you? You got to take care of yourself. That's how I interpret this. This is how I read in this. His family loved him. They cared for him. They didn't want to see him consumed by the mob. They wanted to protect him. That's what they're doing. They didn't really think he was crazy. They knew who he was. All right. Moving on, verses 22 through 30. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebub. Blech. I'm used to saying Beelzebub, but Mark says Beelzebul. He is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out demons. And he called them to him and said to them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but is coming to an end. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his goods unless he first binds the strong man. Then, indeed, he may plunder his house. Truly, I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit never has forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. And then Mark adds, for they were saying, he has an unclean spirit. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this passage. A lot has been written about this, and in particular, that last part, the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit and the unforgivable sin. And again, I think too much has been made of that. If we take it in context, who is Jesus talking to? What's the circumstances going on here? Does this really apply to all of this, or is this another shot at pointing out the hypocrisy of the religious leaders of the day? They were accusing, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, are accusing Jesus of blasphemy, right? That's one of the big no-nos that the Jewish leaders would use against people. You know, these people would come out and, they would be proclaiming either that they were God or just pointing out that the religious leaders had strayed away from what God intended, and they would blasphemy. You don't know that, we're the wise people. You're committing blasphemy. You're claiming to be God. Well, that's what they're saying about Jesus. Jesus comes along, and he is God. But they're trying to, blasphemy. Well, Jesus says to them, I say to you, okay, speaking to the Pharisees and that Sanhedrin group again, the religious leaders, I say to you, all sins will be forgiven the children of man, and whatever blasphemies they utter. All right, they're just so obsessed with blasphemy and they're so legalistic, yet they don't keep the law themselves. And so he's saying, I'm here to forgive all their sins. But the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit has eternal consequences. And he's pointing at them. That's what you're doing. I have the Holy Spirit in me, but you're saying that it's a demonic spirit. They're not recognizing who Jesus is. They're not recognizing the Holy Spirit at work around them. And they attribute it to being demonic. So I don't think that's something that we need to worry about. I think it was a specific accusation against the religious leaders. Look, you're not recognizing me. If you reject Jesus, you don't get the salvation that he's offering. So that we do have to worry about from that perspective. But the blasphemy of the Holy Spirit was what they were doing. They were not recognizing the Holy Spirit at work in and through Jesus was from God. Yet they rejected that and said, oh, well, he's doing all this because he has Satan living in him. He's, it's by Beelzebul that all this is going on. Jesus says, you guys are so far off base. All right, let's wrap it up with verses 31 through 35. And his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. And a crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, your mother and your brothers are outside seeking you. And he answered them, who are my mother and my brothers? And looking about at those who sat around him, he said, here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother. Okay, so what's going on here? Some would think, well, he is rejecting his family. And I don't think Jesus is being disrespectful of his family at all. They may have been coming and saying, hey, dinner's ready. They were coming. It's not like the previous passage where they were trying to drag him away from the crowd that was about to consume him. They're just there. Hey, your mom and your brothers are here. Well, he's having a teaching moment. So it'd be like, if my family was, knocked at the door and said, hey, something important, you got to go. So I'm going to wrap up my teaching here. But Jesus often taught using the surroundings and the circumstances around him as illustrations to make a point. Remember when he was talking to his disciples and taught them the lesson of the vine and the branches. Well, they were walking through a vineyard at that time. So he used the situation. So he's teaching this group. His family shows up and he says, well, let's use this as a teaching opportunity. Who are my brothers and my sisters? And he says, it's those who do the will of God. Right? Family goes beyond flesh and blood. I think some of us in here have family members that we aren't close to, that we really don't consider them family. We are closer to other people than we are our own flesh and blood. Why? Well, if you look at those in the military, those who fight side by side with one another, they become a family, right? They've got each other's back. They've gone through adversity together and they survived and they're drawn closer than flesh and blood. They are brothers and sisters in arms. When we fight side by side with somebody, when we have successes together and we get through adversity together, that draws us together closer than flesh and blood. When we have common goals, when we work together and accomplish something. If you ever go on a mission trip with somebody and you build a building in a foreign country or do a work group, and we've had work groups come to Ministry Haven and do some work, and those people are brought together. They've had a shared experience, and it just binds them together closer. And that's what Jesus is talking about. Those who have a common goal. Jesus came following the will of God, carrying out the plan of salvation, God's plan of salvation. And he said, those of you who follow the will of God, you are my brother, you are my sister. We have this common goal. We're striving to lift up the name of God, build God's kingdom, following God's will in your life. That's who my family is. So if you want to be part of Jesus' family, do the will of God. So that's the takeaway as we wrap up chapter 3, is are you doing the will of God? Are you a member of Jesus' family? Are you his brother or his sister? You are if you are doing the will of God.